Damon Calloway never believed in love. It was a distraction, one that had no place in his meticulously built empire. Relationships, emotions, attachments, they all led to complications, and complications slowed a man down. He hadn't worked his way up from nothing to become a self-made millionaire by indulging in foolish fantasies. No, he thrived on control, discipline, and an unwavering focus on success. That was until her. It started at a charity gala. Damon wasn't there for the cause, he rarely was. His attendance was a calculated move, a way to keep his public image spotless. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he stood by the bar, sipping his scotch, his gaze scanning the ballroom with detached indifference. He had no intention of staying long. Then he saw her. She wasn't like the other women in the room, those who draped themselves in designer gowns and dripped in diamonds, their laughter rehearsed, their smiles calculated. No, this woman had an effortless elegance, an understated confidence. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that alone made her the most captivating person in the room. Her deep emerald green dress hugged her figure in a way that was stunning yet simple. Dark hair cascaded over her bare shoulders, and those eyes, God, those eyes held something he couldn't quite place. Curiosity, defiance, amusement. As if she sensed his gaze, she turned, locking eyes with him. Instead of looking away, she smirked. It wasn't flirtatious or coy, it was as if she saw right through him. Intriguing. Damon rarely approached women, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't care to. But something about her pulled him in. He crossed the room without hesitation. "You look like you're enjoying yourself," he said, voice smooth, confident. She raised an eyebrow. "And you look like you'd rather be anywhere else." His lips twitched. "Observant. It's not hard to tell," she said, taking a sip of her champagne. "Let me guess you're one of the men who came here out of obligation, not interest." He tilted his head slightly. "And what makes you think that? For one, you're standing here instead of networking. 2, you haven't faked a single polite laugh all night. And 3, you're watching everything but engaging with nothing." Damon felt something he hadn't in a long time: amusement. "You've got me figured out already," she shrugged. "Call it a talent. And what about you?" he asked. "Are you here out of obligation or interest?" "Neither," she said. "I'm here because my best friend begged me to come and I owed her one. But I draw the line at pretending to be impressed by men in overpriced suits." He chuckled. "I suppose I should be grateful you're even talking to me," she smirked. "Oh, you should." Damon extended a hand. "Damon Calloway." She hesitated for a moment before shaking it. "Elena Harper." The name suited her: strong, classic, memorable. For the first time in years, Damon felt something shift inside him. Elena wasn't throwing herself at him. She wasn't impressed by his name. She wasn't trying to charm him. And yet, he wanted to know more. The next time he saw her, it wasn't by chance. Damon had resources, and when he wanted something, he got it. He found out where she worked, an independent art gallery downtown, and made sure he had a reason to be there. When he walked in, she was arranging a new display, her sleeves rolled up, a slight smudge of paint on her wrist. She looked up, surprised, then narrowed her eyes. "You can't tell me you just happened to stumble in here," she said. He smirked. "And if I did," she crossed her arms, "then I'd call you a liar." Damon chuckled. "All right, you got me." "I looked you up," she sighed dramatically. "Stalker behavior, Calloway." He leaned against the counter. "I prefer determined." Elena shook her head, but there was a hint of a smile. "All right then, why are you here?" "I was curious," he admitted. "About what?" "You." For the first time, she seemed slightly caught off guard, but Elena recovered quickly. "That's dangerous, you know." Damon raised an eyebrow. "Why?" She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just enough to make his pulse tick up. "Because when people get curious, they start caring. And something tells me you don't do well with distractions." She wasn't wrong. And yet, for the first time in his life, Damon wasn't sure he cared. Damon wasn't a man who second-guessed himself. He made decisions quickly, executed them flawlessly, and never looked back. But something about Elena lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Days passed, and yet he found himself thinking about the way she smirked, the way she held her ground, the way she didn't treat him like the powerful, untouchable man the rest of the world did. It was unsettling but not unwelcome, so when an opportunity presented itself, he didn't ignore it. A new art exhibition was opening at one of the most prestigious galleries in the city, a place where only the elite were invited. Damon had no personal interest in art, but he had connections, and he knew Elena would never get through the front door on her own, not because she lacked talent, but because the industry was ruthless. He made a single phone call, and within hours, her gallery had received an invitation. He hadn't told her. When the night arrived, Damon was already there, his presence commanding even in a room filled with the city's wealthiest patrons. He spotted Elena the moment she walked in, her expression shifting from curiosity to suspicion as she scanned the space. She was dressed in a sleek black gown, elegant but not ostentatious, and there was something about the way she carried herself that made her stand out even in a crowd dripping with designer labels. She moved through the room cautiously, absorbing the atmosphere. Then her gaze landed on him, her eyes narrowed. She approached, her steps deliberate, and when she stopped in front of him, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "You did this," she said, voice low but firm. Damon took a slow sip of his drink, unfazed. "I made a call." Her jaw tightened. "Why?" He tilted his head slightly. "Because you belong here." Something flickered in her expression, something he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, annoyance, a mix of both. "I don't need favors," she said after a moment. "This wasn't a favor," he corrected. "It was a correction." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" he smirked. "Not when I see something worth investing in." Elena stared at him for a moment, as if trying to decipher his intentions. Then, with a quiet sigh, she glanced around the room. "I should be networking," she muttered. Damon gestured subtly. "Then let me introduce you to the right people." She hesitated, and for a split second he thought she might refuse. But then, to his surprise, she nodded. "Fine," she said, "but if this is some elaborate attempt to impress me, you should know I'm not easily swayed." Damon chuckled. "Noted." As the night progressed, he watched as she moved through conversations with a sharp wit and an effortless confidence that only reinforced what he already knew: she wasn't like anyone else. She didn't pander, didn't flatter, didn't try to charm her way into opportunity. She let her work speak for itself, and for the first time in a long time, Damon found himself genuinely impressed. That was dangerous, because Damon Calloway didn't get distracted. And yet, Elena Harper was proving to be the exception to every rule he'd ever lived by. Damon wasn't used to feeling unsettled, but something about Elena refused to leave his mind. He had expected her to be grateful for the opportunity he had given her, maybe even a little impressed. Instead, she had taken it in stride, as if she had always known she belonged in that world, and his interference had merely expedited the inevitable. He should have walked away then. Should have let her make her own way without his involvement, but he didn't. The next time he saw her, it wasn't by accident. She was at a small cafe, tucked away in a quiet part of the city, a place that didn't cater to men like him. No valet, no high-end branding, just the scent of fresh pastries and the hum of quiet conversations. Damon had never stepped foot inside before, but he knew she came here often. He entered, scanning the space until he found her at a corner table by the window. She was focused on the sketchbook in front of her, absent-mindedly twisting a pen between her fingers, lost in thought. She didn't notice him until he slid into the seat across from her. Her eyes flicked up, recognition flashing before she leaned back slightly, her surprise quickly masked by amusement. The familiarity of the reaction was unexpected. "You again," she said, closing her sketchbook. Damon set his phone down on the table, watching her carefully. "You sound disappointed. Just curious." Her lips curled slightly at the edges. "What brings a man like you to a place like this? I wanted to see you." Elena studied him for a long moment, as if waiting for an ulterior motive to reveal itself. When nothing came, she exhaled, shaking her head. "You don't give up, do you? Not when something interests me." She took a slow sip of her coffee, eyes never leaving his. "And what exactly interests you?" Damon leaned forward slightly. "You," the word hung between them, heavier than it should have been. For a second, something flickered in her gaze, something hesitant, something guarded. He wondered if she felt it too, the strange pull that neither of them seemed willing to name. Then, just as quickly, she exhaled, breaking the moment. "You don't seem like the type who pursues things without a reason," she said. Damon considered that. He wasn't. He calculated everything in his life, made decisions based on logic, not impulse. And yet, here he was, sitting across from a woman who defied every expectation he had ever had. "I don't waste time," he admitted, "but I also don't ignore things that matter." Elena's expression softened for the briefest moment before she looked away. "This is a bad idea," she murmured. His jaw tightened. "Why?" She let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Because you're not the kind of man who lets things get messy," she gestured vaguely. "And this has messy written all over it." Damon had spent his entire life avoiding complications. He built walls, kept people at a distance, maintained control over every aspect of his existence. But with Elena, control felt like an illusion, and for the first time he wasn't sure he cared. By the time Damon left the cafe, something had shifted. Elena hadn't agreed to anything, hadn't promised anything, but she also hadn't told him to stay away, and in his world that was enough. Over the next few weeks, they fell into an unspoken rhythm. He found reasons to see her, excuses that weren't really excuses at all. A new gallery opening. A late-night conversation that stretched for hours. A dinner neither of them called a date, but both knew it was. She challenged him in ways no one else did, pushed back when others would have folded. She didn't care about his wealth, didn't care about the power he wielded, and that made her dangerous. He wasn't sure when it happened, when the line he had so carefully drawn blurred beyond recognition. But one evening, as they stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, the city stretched out beneath them. He realized there was no going back. Elena was standing near the edge, her arms folded as she gazed at the skyline, the wind tugging at her hair. She had been quiet all night, her usual sharp wit subdued, her thoughts elsewhere. Damon stepped beside her. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated before turning to face him. "You." The admission hit harder than it should have. She searched his face, something unspoken lingering in her gaze. "What are we doing, Damon?" He had no answer. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure. But then she stepped closer, and suddenly, logic didn't matter. She tilted her head slightly, waiting, giving him the choice. Damon had built his life on certainty, on control. And yet, as he reached for her, as his hand found the curve of her waist, as her breath hitched, he realized he had never been more uncertain about anything in his life. And for once, he didn't care. Damon had always ruled his world with precision. Every decision was carefully calculated, every move strategically placed to ensure control. He had built his fortune by keeping emotions at bay, by never letting anyone get close enough to disrupt the order he had imposed on his life. And yet, Elena had come in like a force of nature, unraveling everything he thought he knew. She wasn't a woman who could be controlled, nor did she want to be. She met him at his sharpest edges and refused to soften them, challenging him in ways no one ever had. And despite every instinct he had honed over the years, he found himself wanting more of her, needing her in a way that defied logic. It wasn't just the way she pushed back, the way she refused to be impressed by his wealth or power. It was the way she looked at him like she saw the man beneath the empire, the man stripped of all the expectations the world placed on him. And that terrified him. Because if she could see him, really see him, then she could break him. But the thought of walking away, that was unbearable. The realization of how deep he had fallen came one evening when Elena invited him into her world, a world so different from his own. She had been working late at the gallery, preparing for an exhibit that meant more to her than anything before. Unlike the polished, high-profile events Damon was used to attending, this was personal. It was a small, intimate showcase of artists who had struggled to gain recognition, a night dedicated to those who had fought to be seen. When he arrived, she was in the middle of arranging the last few pieces, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly undone, completely immersed in her work. She barely looked up when he entered, but somehow she knew it was him. "You're early," she murmured, stepping back to examine a painting. Damon leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You sound surprised," she smiled, shaking her head. "I guess I am." For a moment he just stood there, taking her in. There was something about seeing her like this, completely in her element, that made his chest tighten in a way he wasn't prepared for. She wasn't dressed for a gala, wasn't trying to be anything other than herself. And yet, he had never seen anyone more captivating. When she finally turned to face him fully, her expression softened. "You didn't have to come." He pushed off the wall, closing the space between them. "I wanted to." Elena searched his face as if trying to find the catch, the reason behind his presence. But there was none. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You are impossible, Damon Calloway." And then, before he could respond, she reached for him, her fingers curling into his jacket as she pulled him close. The kiss wasn't hurried or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, and unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, whispering, "This is dangerous." Damon closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the scent of her, the warmth of her so close. "I don't care." Because for the first time in his life, Damon Calloway wasn't thinking about outcomes or consequences. He was just thinking about her. The next few weeks were unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had been with women before, had entertained fleeting relationships that served their purpose before inevitably fading. But this wasn't fleeting. It wasn't shallow or convenient. It was consuming. Elena had become an unavoidable part of his life, slipping into the cracks of his carefully structured routine and making herself at home in ways he hadn't anticipated. Late nights turned into early mornings, conversations that stretched for hours, moments stolen in between meetings and obligations. And with every passing day, the walls he had once kept so firmly in place crumbled a little more. She didn't ask for anything, didn't demand more than he could give. But somehow, she had taken up space in his life in a way that made it impossible to remember what it had been like before her. And that should have scared him. Maybe it did. But if fear meant losing her, then Damon was willing to embrace it. He didn't realize just how much she had changed him until one night, when she fell asleep in his penthouse, curled up on his couch after a long day at the gallery. He had been working late, reviewing contracts, his mind tangled in numbers and negotiations. But when he looked up and saw her there, peaceful, completely at ease in his space, something in his chest tightened. He set his papers aside, carefully moving toward her. She stirred slightly as he knelt beside the couch, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She murmured something unintelligible, her lips parting slightly as she shifted, one hand instinctively reaching for him in her sleep. Damon exhaled slowly, overwhelmed by the sheer force of what he felt. In that moment, he knew. He had spent his entire life believing love was a distraction, Something that weakened a man made him vulnerable. But as he sat there, watching Elena sleep, he realized he had been wrong. Because loving her didn't make him weak, it made him whole. Damon had built his life on control, on calculated risks, precise decisions, and an unshakable certainty in his own instincts. But Elena Harper had dismantled every rule he had lived by, slipping into his world not like a storm but like a quiet inevitability. He hadn't planned for her. He hadn't expected her. And yet, she had carved a space in his life with such ease that he could no longer imagine his world without her in it. The realization came to him late one evening, after another long day of meetings and negotiations. He stepped into his penthouse, expecting the usual silence that once felt like peace, but now only reminded him of how empty the space was when she wasn't there. She had spent the previous night with him, but now the absence of her presence was stark. There was no sketchbook left on the coffee table, no faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. He loosened his tie, exhaling slowly. He had always thought love was a distraction, something that took more than it gave. But without her, the quiet felt less like control and more like loneliness. Damon grabbed his phone and called her. When she picked up, her voice was soft, but there was something in it that made him pause, an edge of hesitation, of uncertainty. She had never hesitated before. Something was wrong. By the time he arrived at her apartment, his pulse had settled into a steady, unfamiliar rhythm concern. He knocked once, and when she opened the door, he saw it immediately. She had been crying. It wasn't obvious. Elena would never allow herself to be seen as vulnerable so easily, but he knew her too well now. Her eyes were slightly red, her expression carefully composed in that way people used when they were trying to pretend everything was fine. She stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He had spent a lifetime reading people, analyzing motives and weaknesses, but with her, none of that mattered. He didn't want to dissect her emotions, he just wanted to understand them. She walked toward the window, arms crossed, her posture tense. He followed, keeping a small distance between them. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Earlier that day, she had received an opportunity to move to Paris, to work with artists she had admired for years. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice. Damon felt something tighten in his chest. She had known about it for days but hadn't told him. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. The weight of it settled between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. For the first time in his life, Damon didn't have an immediate answer. He could have told her to stay. He could have reminded her that she was building something here, that she didn't need to leave to prove herself. But he couldn't do that. Because he had never wanted to be the reason she gave up something she wanted. Instead, he simply asked her what she wanted. She turned to him then, her gaze searching his. She wanted the opportunity, but she also wanted him. And for the first time, she didn't know if she could have both. Damon had spent his life making decisions based on logic, but as he looked at her, he knew some things weren't meant to be calculated. He told her he wasn't letting her go. For the first time since he arrived, she let out a shaky breath, as if she had been holding it in all along. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and when she rested her forehead against his, he felt the final wall around his heart fall completely. Love wasn't a distraction. It was the only thing that had ever mattered, and he would prove it to her every day for the rest of his life. Damon had never been a man who hesitated. Every decision he made was swift, precise, and without regret. But standing in Elena's apartment, her body pressed close to his, her breath warm against his skin, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had told her he wasn't letting her go. And he meant it. But how did he prove that? How did a man who had spent his life keeping people out show the one person he couldn't afford to lose that she was everything? He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hands still resting at her waist. Her gaze was steady, searching his face for something unspoken. He could see the conflict there, the pull of her dream against the weight of what they had built. She didn't have to say it, he already knew. She wanted both, and so did he. But love wasn't about keeping someone tied down. It wasn't about forcing choices. If she was going to Paris, she had to do it without regret, without wondering what could have been. Damon tightened his hold on her just slightly. "Then we'll figure it out." Elena blinked as if surprised by how easily he had said it. "You mean?" He nodded once. "You go to Paris." Her brows pulled together, uncertainty flashing across her face. "And what about us?" Damon exhaled, brushing his thumb over her hip. "Do you really think I'd let distance change anything?" She didn't answer immediately. He could see the thoughts racing behind her eyes. The years of being independent, of fighting for everything she had, making her question if something this good could last. So he made the decision for both of them. "We'll make it work. I'll fly to you, you'll fly to me. And when you're ready, when you've done everything you need to do there, you come back." Her lips parted slightly, surprise flickering in her expression. "You do that for me?" Damon let out a quiet, amused breath. "I'd do anything for you." For the first time that night, her body relaxed against him, the weight of uncertainty lifting between them. She reached up, threading her fingers through his hair, and when she smiled, really smiled, he knew he had made the right choice. Because loving someone wasn't about keeping them in one place. It was about standing beside them no matter where they went, and there was no world Damon wanted to exist in where Elena Harper wasn't his. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Elena prepared for Paris, balancing the excitement of the opportunity with the bittersweet knowledge that she would be leaving Damon behind, at least temporarily. But true to his word, he never wavered. He helped her with everything, setting up contacts in Paris, ensuring she had the best accommodations, even surprising her with a private loft in the heart of the city before she had a chance to look for a place herself. "Damon," she had sighed, shaking her head in disbelief when he revealed it. He had only smirked. "You didn't actually think I'd let you struggle to find a place, did you?" And just like that, she had stopped protesting. Saying goodbye at the airport had been the hardest thing. Elena had never been one for grand romantic gestures, but as she stood at the gate, her fingers curled around Damon's jacket, she realized just how deeply she had fallen. "You better keep your promise," she murmured against his chest. Damon tilted her chin up, his gaze intense. "Have I ever broken one?" She shook her head. "Then trust me," he said. "This isn't goodbye." And when he kissed her, right there in the middle of the airport, the world faded away. Time passed, but distance never changed them. Damon flew to Paris whenever his schedule allowed, never staying away for long. Elena thrived in her new role, her talent gaining recognition in ways she had only dreamed of. But no matter how far she went, no matter how successful she became, she always found herself longing for the moments when Damon walked through her door, when his presence filled the space around her like he had never left. And just as he had promised, when she was ready, she came back. She had been gone for nearly a year when she stepped off the plane, scanning the crowd until she found him. Damon was waiting just as he always had been. The moment their eyes met, everything else disappeared. She barely made it 2 steps before he closed the distance between them, his arms wrapping around her, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that held every moment they had spent apart. When they finally pulled away, breathless, she smiled up at him. "I'm home." Damon brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb trailing over her cheek. "You always were." And for the first time in his life, everything was exactly as it was meant to be. Because love wasn't about control. It was about finding the one person who made every risk worth taking. And Elena Harper had been worth every single one.